Uh, Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this cold New York evening. And my name is Alexander Kaufman. I am a reporter for a variety of energy outlets. You may find my work at Heatmap, Canary Media, The Atlantic, MIT Technology, and other places. I've been reporting on the nuclear industry for the better part of the last half decade and have reported on nuclear all over the world, but it is something that has always been particularly close to home for me as a native New Yorker. I have watched the effects on our energy grid and on my utility bills here in Brooklyn for the last few years since the closure of Indian Point's final reactor in 2021. And I have watched keenly as there have been debates over what to do about that in the absence of the power that was lost with that closure. Now, as we look across the United States, there has been a major push, not just toward building nuclear again for the first time in this country in quite a long time, but also restarting existing plants that have been shut down in recent years but are salvageable. And while Indian Point is at a further point of decommissioning than perhaps the Palisades nuclear plant in Michigan, which is set to be the first in the United States to return to operations after a permanent shutdown. There is a technical possibility and increasingly perhaps a social license for that same kind of reconstruction to take place at Indian Point. So the goal of this webinar was to provide a venue for a thoughtful, empirical, and objective conversation between our panelists about what that might look like, what happens next, and what the technical and social challenges could be to achieving that. I am here to moderate this discussion. I will interview our three esteemed panelists for a bit, and then we will take questions from the audience, which I will select through the chat and read out, and we will answer. We'll wrap up in 72 minutes now. So let's get going. I'd like to start by introducing each of the panelists, and as I go through them, invite them to sort of spell out the position that they're coming from. And to begin, I'd like to invite Richard Naska to speak first. Please introduce yourself, Richard. Tell us who you are, and if you can, set the scene a little bit for what the conditions on the grid are like today as a result of this closure. I think that will help to guide our conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you. And hello, everybody. Thank you for having me here. My name is Rich Nask. I got 25 years in the utility industry. Right now, I'm a senior business agent for UWA Local 1-2, obviously out of New York, utility industries. Like I said, I had 25 years in the business. I've been a business agent for 5 years, representing 13 different companies involved in utilities across New York. Myself, before I came up as a business agent delegate, I was a senior operator for substations in New York and New York City, um, all high voltage grid work. I'm excited to be here today to really just give my locals position in the utility industry, mostly at large, um, our excitement about, I guess, spreading the news and talking about nuclear and how that should be a way to look at, green non-carbon power. Um, so I wanted to talk about the grid a little bit because we all have concerns about the way it's been going. I mean, so since Indian Point has closed, we've lost 2,000 megawatts on the system from Indian Point, right? Which were not completely replaced. So there's concerns about that. There have been some strains on the grid because of that. Some, uh, down in the city as well. So we've been relying mostly on peaker plants, which they obviously are under the microscope here because they're burning fossil fuels. considered to be dirty burners, and really they do not and don't normally run for long periods of time at all. They really just are cut into the grid at peak loads. And now that is not a norm anymore. The norm is that they're running more and more because we do not have on-demand nuclear like we lost in Indian Point. And for instance, we have probably about seven peakers around the city and out on the island. And just for instance, in the Bronx alone, the peakers there have tripled their time on the system. And Queens, which has a few peakers there, have gone 2.5 times their running time to try to keep up with the increasing loads. So we know in the industry that the loads will increase due to electrification, EV vehicles. So we know the load's coming up. We also know that due to electrification, our peak loads might actually shift to the winter time, where most of our peak loads were, generally around the summertime with air conditioning and cooling and whatnot. We used the winter time as downtime, outage time, to keep up with equipment on the grid, preventative maintenance on breakers and transformers, reactors and series reactors and whatnot with the grid, transmission lines and whatnot. And that is also fading away because we do not really have the capacity to keep up and also have different routes and avenues for power while we have this down for preventative maintenance. So we know the importance of the restoration and rebuilding of Indian Point if possible. I did represent over 400 employees out of Indian Point before its closure. They contributed to businesses around the area. It was very important to the area, and most of these people did not have a just transition with finding other work. They were left on their own, leaving with the talent that they had and the very high training to leave for different jobs, and most of them not in nuclear. And if they wanted to stay in nuclear, they were pretty much had to go down south to do so and move out of the state, which took their tax revenues with them. So these effects back up. Okay. I know that if it was a possibility to get nuclear back at Indian Point, uh, a lot of these women and men were, moved out of their state and would love to come back and regain that shirt training and also, share their knowledge behind the training and move it on to a younger generation.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. So I'd like to offer it next to Vivek Sri Krishnan, who I think can give us a really good kind of high-level perspective, especially on policy. So Vivek, please introduce yourself and give us a picture of how you see things and where some of the challenges are.
Hi. So yeah, my name is Vivek Srikrishnan. I'm an assistant professor in biological and environmental engineering at Cornell. And I study climate risk management, really kind of broadly understood. But one of the specific areas that I'm interested in is energy system decarbonization and how climate change might impact power system reliability. How do changing temperatures and changing meteorological variability impact the performance of the grid? And so as part of that, some of the research that we've done has looked at the challenges facing the grid over the next few years, years to decades, and some possible solutions and what those might look like. And one of them involves, the addition of nuclear, such as reopening Indian Point, right? And I will say, I don't have a prescriptive view on this. I don't necessarily have a fully vested interest in which of these strategies New York takes. But I do think there are opportunities to avoid some trade-offs that Indian Point can be a part of. That any strategy that we take is going to have certain pros and cons, and nuclear should be part of the conversation about how we might navigate those trade-offs going forward. And so, actually, Richard already has discussed several of the points that I was hoping to make, which I think just shows how kind of central they are to all of the challenges faced by the grid. So, electrification, the addition of large loads like data centers, these can result in really monstrous loads, particularly during the winter. But even the summer loads are likely to increase, particularly with the cooling demands of some of these, large loads that might come online. Um, and so, some of these data centers that have already are being planned are in the 300 to 600 megawatt range. And so each of them together, if they're running full time, that's 2 to 4% of the current generation of the grid, right? And that's one of these data centers. So we're really looking at a large potential increase in the, not potential increase, we are looking at a large increase in the amount of load that we're facing on the grid. And at the same time, we've reduced the amount of generation on the grid. So between fossil retirements and being slower than expected to add new generation, we've actually had a net loss of about 2 gigawatts of generation in New York since 2019. Um, and this is again occurring at the same time that the dynamics that Richard described are occurring, where these loads are increasing. And NISO has projected a 16% increase in load over the next decade, and that's with what I would say are fairly conservative estimates from the current hype and amount of capital expenditures going into data centers for how much might actually, at least nominally, be proposed to be built. Um, and the net result of all of this is more congestion. So the transmission, bulk transmission, right around the state is what it is, right? And we've seen that, increasing transmission is also something that's very slow for a number of different reasons. And the, for all the renewables that we're building out in upstate New York, Western New York, Central New York, that's all great, but then that power needs to get to where the load centers are, which are the Hudson Valley, New York City, and Long Island. And the Total East Interface, which is the main bulk transmission interface that connects these parts of the states, is often congested already and is likely to be even more so in the future, which again means more congestion, more outages, and higher prices for ratepayers, especially downstate. Um, and this is in the background of we're already seeing fairly high price increases. So nationwide, the Energy Information Administration has estimated about a 4.3% increase in rates between 2024 and 25. And again, that we're talking about increased demand pressure, reduced supply, that only ever results in increased prices. And when do we see these effects in our modeling? It tends to be when solar and wind are low, and or when due to extreme temperatures, demand in the downstate region is high. Under either one of those conditions, we tend to see shortages, right, and outages. And it really is just we can't get enough power from upstate to downstate, which means we need more downstate generation. That's the easiest solution to this problem, given the political headwinds that we tend to face when we try to increase transmission. So what I would say is there have sort of been four categories of solutions that have been proposed for what that might look like. So the original CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act plan that is under which New York committed itself to phasing out its thermal generation and increasing or its fossil fuel generation over the next few decades. That really planned for a combination of both batteries downstate, which was has been slower than expected even before the Trump administration announced it was going to freeze offshore leases for offshore wind. So that kind of makes that strategy relatively impractical. And then there was quite a big push to try to increase hydrogen or put a lot of hydrogen on the grid to effectively serve the same role that nuclear has traditionally played, which is sort of a low emissions or no emissions, but dispatchable generation. The problem is, and this is especially true in Europe, right, where there's been an even bigger push for hydrogen than there has been in the United States, these haven't really emerged at scale, right? For all the money that's sort of been put into hydrogen, it seems like we're pretty far from actually seeing the ability to generate meaningful electricity from hydrogen. And there are also environmental impacts from hydrogen. So one of the things that my lab is working on are how does sourcing electricity for hydrogen kind of add embedded CO2 emissions into that hydrogen itself, right? Just from the process of getting electricity from the grid to even if you have on-site renewables, it actually turns out to be a fairly non-trivial amount of CO2 that you're adding to the grid. Um, and any leaks of hydrogen into the atmosphere worsen the impacts of methane, which is a fairly potent greenhouse gas that, actually has a very strong global warming potential. So while hydrogen doesn't directly have any greenhouse gas effect, it worsens some of the greenhouse gases that we're already sending into the atmosphere. So that's a trade-off, right? That might exist if we continue down that route. The other is, well, we could continue to rely on the peaking plants, right? Or we're going to have to build more of them. So, like, do we build new fossil fueled plants? Richard was talking about how we're overutilizing the plants that were designed to be peaking plants, they weren't designed to run relatively continuously. And of course, that has all sorts of different environmental and cost externalities, right? They add greenhouse gas emissions. They add other environmental contaminants. So air quality tends to be much poorer around these plants. This has been and in particular, in the city, for example, these peaking plants tend to be built near low-income communities, right? So there's kind of an environmental justice aspect to that component as well. And if you remember, what was it that replaced Indian Point's generation? It wasn't new renewables. It was three gas plants, right? So that's been what the substitution has been currently. Um, and that has meant that a large part of the downstate generation has increased to being natural gas. So, um, again, from EIA, it was 77% before Indian Point closed. Now it's 89% of the fuel that's consumed to generate electricity downstate. And then finally, the other option is, as part of the portfolio anyway, is nuclear, right? So there's always economic concerns around nuclear, right? That's always one of the things that people talk about in the policy space because nuclear is it costs a lot to build these plants, but you get a low cost of electricity at the end of it. And given that we're expected to see these increases in prices, nuclear is a way to kind of reduce what that cost of electricity is versus something like natural gas, where you're subject to, I think this was mentioned already, right? The competition with heating for the supply or just any kind of supply shock, right? Natural gas is an internationally traded commodity. So it's subject to what happens in Russia, for example, or what happens in Ukraine, that those price shocks impact the price of natural gas domestically. There's economic, there's an economic consideration for nuclear. It's the generation is relatively stable, right? You don't have the level of variability that you have with renewables. Again, there's benefits here that could end up avoiding some of the other externalities that could be associated with some of the other strategies to increasing generation.
Great. Vivek, thank you so much. Now, I want to turn to Paris Ortiz Wines. And Paris, I was hoping that you could introduce yourself, but then give us perhaps a picture of how we've seen opinions about nuclear shifting around the country and around the world. And, some of what you've seen in places that had once, embraced closures or phase outs around this technology and what it was that ultimately cause them to reverse course.
Yeah, so I run Stand Up for Nuclear. So it's an initiative basically focused on advancing support for nuclear worldwide. So through activating leaders, catalyzing action through public engagement. And over the last 5 years through my work, I've seen how quickly politics, public opinion, and culture can change around nuclear, especially in my home state of California. And so we're approaching a new moment here in New York. It is a completely different time than when Indian Point was shut down. We're entering a new era where we're seeing nuclear restarts. You guys mentioned Palisades. We're also seeing it with Three Mile Island, Duane Arnold. We're seeing plant extensions. We're seeing California, that everybody told us that it was a done deal, see that Diablo get extended for a minimum of 5 years. We're seeing state moratoriums being repealed. We just had Illinois recently repealed their moratorium against large water reactors. And we're seeing, public opinion at its highest that we've ever seen. So hoping to bring, this international insight and experience and seeing how things shift so quickly to highlight this opportunity, this moment for New York, and to add some color. So, in my home state of California, we were in a very similar situation to Indian Point. So I was there when it closed, and we joined up with Mayor Knickerbocker and other locals to commemorate the loss, to celebrate the all of the clean energy that was given to the state and locals. Um, and it was a completely different time. So in California, we, similar to Indian Point, we're going to relicense. And we had political forces just like in New York. Our now Governor Newsom actually was the one that said, do not attempt to relicense. We are not going to allow this to go through. That was in 2016. And nobody talked about Diablo Canyon until 2020. And what happens? Politics isn't physics. It can change on a dime. Circumstances can change very quickly that can influence not only political capital or social light and create social license. And so in California, 2020, you have rolling blackouts, the first that we've ever seen in 19 years. And I think when it comes down to it, and what we're seeing, a federal bipartisan concern is for reliability, affordability. You need energy, regardless of where it comes from. Climate is second. Um, and we saw that Diablo started coming up. And so our coalition we are from the civil society part. So we hope to create social license and external pressure. And what we saw was, an MIT Stanford report came out detailing, similar points that my two other panelists have detailed of like, what are the economic impacts? What are the climate benefits to it? And I think that, along with a civil society push, we saw Governor Newsom 5 months before legislation was proposed, LA Times publicly reconsidering Diablo Canyon. Then we see Dianne Feinstein, prominent anti-nuclear politician, come out and change. And so what we're seeing is reliability, affordability matters, and it is a big concern for folks. So we're seeing in Spain right now, they're fighting against their phase out that's in place. We're seeing in Belgium, although they've lost a couple reactors, it is through our advocates there that we're able to gain two extensions for two of their reactors. So I think what we're seeing is when energy crisis hits, when prices are going up, you need something that works. And nuclear has been the silent, unsung hero in the back for the last 60 plus years producing energy. So in the United States, 20% of our electricity comes from nuclear and nearly 50% of our clean electricity. So in my home state, everybody told us not to talk about Diablo Canyon. Just leave it alone. We're going to go with renewables. We're going to do solar, but we still receive 40% of our electricity from natural gas. And in New York, you guys have a very high percentage of generation coming from natural gas. And similar to what Richard mentioned, we are extending our natural gas plants because we do not have enough power. And we have real life data from Indian Point, from San Onofre, from Vermont Yankee. When you shut down nuclear plants, they are mainly replaced with fossil fuels. So if we are worried about climate change decarbonization, when you close nuclear, that's what happens. And so what we're seeing now in New York is a moment where there's federal bipartisan support, there's federal financial incentives that could be used to restart Indian Point. And we're seeing public, as I mentioned, public support at its highest nationwide. So I'm coming from a perspective where I've done these campaigns in different areas. It would be a major disservice to citizens of New York to not discuss this new opportunity, this new moment that we're seeing, because as Vivek mentioned, the energy demand, it is so high, and we need to protect us normal people that don't work at these data centers. We're not tech companies, and we need to preserve our reliability and our cheap affordability of electricity prices. So at the end of the day, that can be a big portion of your paycheck.
Thank you, Paris. And I see that many of you are already posting there, which is excellent. But just a reminder that if you go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, you can start asking questions. And toward the end of the webinar, I will come and curate those and pose them to the appropriate panelists. So I wanted to first address some of what Indian Point is and how that kind of compares to the broader picture of nuclear right now. So, something interesting that came up. I actually went on a tour for a story that I had hoped was going to come out by the time we had this webinar, but will come out later. Um, that where I visited and I toured the site, and something that I found quite striking is that right toward the end of Indian Point's operation, it had actually achieved a world record for continuously running for the longest period of time, and that the engineers and the operators there were quite proud that after the decades of running at that plant, they had actually achieved such an extraordinarily record-breaking high degree of capacity and stewardship of the plant. So, I in recognizing that, I also recognize that there is a perception among some skeptics, perhaps, who supported the closure of the plant that it was an older technology. There are certainly many people who are open-minded to some of the newer reactor models that are billed as safer than older models. And I wonder if any of you, Richard, Vivek, or Paris, I'll leave it up to whichever one chooses to answer first, um, talk a little bit about the actual mechanics of the reactors that were there. And if you can, the state that they are currently in. And so what we're talking about when we're talking about a reopening, are we talking about the reconstruction of one of those existing reactors? And if so, can you tell us a little bit about the state of it and the safety of it compared to some things that are being discussed now? And if not, if we're talking about a reconstruction, what would that actually look like? And, what could locals expect from the potential safety or the potential risk involved in that?
I could speak on that a little bit. The site is pretty far down the decommissioning trail right now, but nothing's irreversible. Anything's possible, right? So two new nuclear reactors would have to be reconstructed there. Um, the safety of the project. I mean, there's a lot of fear and speculation around nuclear. And to be honest with you, we've been working with nuclear reactors and electrical construction for years, and it is safe, and we're able to do it safe and well. We're amongst the highest trained utility workers in the nation. It's nothing new to us. It's nothing new to the building trades that also work hand in hand with us. So as far as safety goes, safety would not be a question in the construction or restoration or rebuilding of the plant at all. This is our industry. This is what we do for a living. We're proud of it.
Yeah, similar to you, Alex, I just went on a tour and I reached out to our Holtec contact there. And there's a couple of there's about four pieces that would need to be reconstructed at the moment. The containment building, because it is non-tensioned, they could do an usual fix for the containment. The turbine halls, the control rooms, they're all still there. Intake structure is still there. The reactor heads are gone, easily can be replaced. The upper and lower internals will need to be replaced. And the reactor coolant system, the loops have been cut and those can be replaced. And they will be giving a full update, I believe, next week on December 11th during the decommissioning. So for folks interested in the nitty-gritty and more technical pieces of that, can go to that meeting. But I just verified with him what would need to be done. And so there's currently 300 people on site, and some of those folks have actually been used to help with the Palisades restart. So, like other nuclear plants, the expertise and knowledge and the labor, we have it. And what we've seen in Illinois too, where if we want something done, we're gonna do it. And so at the last minute, we say Byron and Dresden. So I think if there's enough political and social will to do it, we can do it, and it's physically possible to do a restart and a rebuild of Indian Point. Holtec has cited it would take 4 years, $8 to $10 billion. And what we've seen federally is that there are incentives under the Loan Programs Office that could cover up to 80% of the construction costs. So it wouldn't just be on the state. There is federal support that did start with the support federally did start under Biden and has continued under this new administration.
Got it. So I'd like to, yeah, while we're on this topic, I think it would be good to address one of the issues that has, I think, caused a lot of fear and concern in the New York local press in recent years, and this has been around the issue of tritium. So naturally, I think nuclear reactors produce tritiated water. It gets released from all, nuclear plants around the world into waterways. If I understand correctly from scientists who have studied this for years and who I've interviewed, there's actually more tritium in the oceans and in water from the haphazard disposal of red exit signs, that the tritium is something that adds to that, and actually from stardust, from shooting stars that deposit that in the seas. Nevertheless, this is something that has repeatedly been used to, I think, justify a lot of concern over nuclear, not just in New York. I mean, we saw this when the wastewater from Fukushima was being diluted and flushed into the Pacific Ocean. You had propaganda coming from the Chinese government about this being a massive safety concern, although on an actual like parts per million basis, the active Chinese nuclear plants were pumping way more of this stuff into those shared waterways than was being flushed through this. Nevertheless, as Holtec, the owner of the Indian Point site today, has looked to continue some of those dispersals into the Hudson River, as happened for decades beforehand. You've seen a lot of coverage in the New York press about dumping radioactive waste, which of course sort of brings to mind the proverbial image of a Simpsons-esque glowing goo in a barrel being dumped into the river. So I was hoping that you could add to what I've said, if any of you want to jump in and speak to what that means, and speak to what the overall safety record from the plant was like when it was in operation.
Right, I can speak on that a little bit too. The safety record for the plant was outstanding at Indian Point. As far as Trinity goes and expelling water into the Hudson, that is something that has happened over decades. This water is very highly treated and expelled at very acceptable levels. It's been said that you could eat a lifetime of fish in that area and not have any effect from it. So I mean, our safety record over there at Indian Point was great at the time of operation. There were no fines for that or any effect to fish life or anything like that in the area.
Yeah, I think, yeah, go ahead,
Oh, go ahead.
Alex.
No, please. I,
I was going to say that overall, radiation, tritium, anything radioactive is super scary. And I think it's still something that, when I try and explain it, you have to add context to it, And so wanted to pull up, the dose a local New Yorker may have received from Indian Point's tritium discharge over the course of an entire year is equivalent to the dose that a person would get from eating a banana. And I know that sounds crazy, but to put it in perspective, and with the tritium water that's being released with at Fukushima down in Japan, the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, is on site. They produce the reports, they show the levels. And I think it's just providing that context for folks because if you don't know and it seems like you're just throwing radioactive water into the Hudson, of course you're going to be scared. Of course you won't want it. And so I just encourage those to see similar examples that have continued to happen. Discharge happens with nuclear plants, and there's multiple bodies that are able to regulate it.
Great. I know that there are myriad other questions around safety that I think there are very accessible answers to. And, if people are, if some of the audience is very curious about some particular things that get discussed a lot, like terrorism risk or anything, we can perhaps discuss that on the back end or direct you to some resources that I think answer those substantively. But, to move on to fresher ground, there's something that I find particularly notable in these kinds of conversations, which is the counterfactual, not just of the risk that nuclear does or doesn't pose, but the risk that the absence of nuclear may pose. And Vivek, I think it'd be nice to drill down on this a little bit with you. I think you touched on this in your opening statement really nicely, but if you could tell us a little bit about what some of the uh, you know, human risks are from some of the scenarios that you outlined with, higher rates, with, greater risk of outages, and what some of the challenges are to solutions that I think, a lot of people, particularly, perhaps people that are concerned about climate change and would therefore be perhaps open-minded to, a large source of clean baseload power like nuclear, but still find themselves more comfortable with things like, rooftop solar or, wind projects upstate, and I guess it begs that question, particularly with some of the levelized cost of energy benefits of those renewables. Why, what is the advantage to, more condensed site like Indian Point compared to some of those things? And what are the risks if you were to rely on a scenario where you don't have that kind of base load to the ordinary ratepayer?
Yeah, so why don't I start with the what happens if we don't have enough energy, right? So what happens if we do see increased outages? I mean, I think increased costs are something everybody can understand, right? That's, as Paris said, that can be a significant chunk of somebody's paycheck, especially during a particularly cold or a particularly hot month, right? And so that's almost kind of self-evident as a concern, right? That if we have higher rates, which inevitably comes whenever you have a tighter margin between supply and demand, um, or you have more volatility, right? So this is again the downside to something like natural gas that's subject to very high price volatility, and it doesn't look like that's going to be reduced anytime in the near future. The that has real economic consequences for people. And on the outage side, so I think we can just look to Texas, right? Look at Winter Storm Uri to see an example of what can happen when the grid fails catastrophically during a peak winter event. And the summer event would look similar in certain ways and different in other ways. But the reality is there was a very real human cost, right? There were a number of casualties and fatalities during as a result of the lack of heating during Uri. Texas homes. So again, it's a little different because we're talking about Texas. This is an area where everything is sort of engineered to withstand a hot climate. And so in a cold climate, you ended up getting people suffering health effects from the cold that they might not in New York because our homes are built in a different way, right? The level of insulation is different. But that being said, exposure to cold for a number of homeless people, for example, or people who are housing disadvantaged, that can have real health effects. And in the summer, it's even worse because exposure to extreme heat can exacerbate a number of underlying health conditions. So I was talking with a colleague recently from who's a medical doctor from Cornell's medical school, who was talking just about the like over your life being exposed to a period of extreme heat reduces your life expectancy in a really dramatic fashion because it makes any heart incidences more likely. It makes the effects of diabetes more pronounced. Like it just has these systematic effects on the human body that don't fully go away. And so um, that's sort of the human side of like what happens if we have these outages. There's also the effects. I briefly, and I think I briefly think I talked about this, and I think Richard did a little bit, that operating these peaking plants with the emissions that they put out also have effects. So, the Bronx's Asthma Alley is not far from a couple of peaking plants that are in the area. And we generally know the criteria air pollutants that come out of fossil fuel power plants have a fairly large impact on health and life expectancy. So one of the consistent co-benefits that we found of climate mitigation, which in general is a reduction in particulate matter of 2.5 microns, PM 2.5, that is really what has a major impact on asthma and other respiratory illnesses. And so, moving away from So that sort of is a reason why the status quo, right, of sort of not really solving the problem, but just kind of saying, well, let's just run these fossil plants more and more and more, kind of has these really negative externalities, right, to them that we might want to avoid. Um, then on the other side, if we think about what some of the other possibilities are, so there is the possibility, right, that what do we do? Well, let's just overbuild renewables in upstate, right? We have more land. Now, that being said, there are still pockets where we see quite a bit of NIMBYism, right? And so there's areas where there's quite a bit of political resistance to expanding transmission or expanding renewables in a way that limits, it does put limits on the amount that you can end up building. And some research has shown that that can actually be a fairly large part like of the land area that might be limited because of that, or at least slow, right? And again, given the pressure on the demand side, we don't really have time to spend before we start adding more generation to the grid. So the bigger problem with adding a lot more solar and wind, in addition to um, the need for battery storage, right, to kind of even out the intertemporal profile a little bit and match, kind of avoid the duck curve, right? So this is what happens around sunset, where you still have peak demand, but you start to reduce the amount of solar. California has been dealing with this for a decade now. You end up seeing a need to really ramp up peaking fossil plants if you haven't planned well, because you end up with that shortage because the sun descends rapidly, but that's when you have peak load. So um, that so you have to build out the batteries. Batteries are still expensive and are still reliant on minerals that are, getting harder to source for a number of different reasons that pose logistical challenges, right? And I think like Paris said, if you really wanted to, could you figure out a way to do that? Probably, but the question is, are those trade-offs kind of necessarily the best overall strategy? And if those renewables are located upstate, so not if they were on Long Island, again, the offshore wind in the CLCPA plan was intended to kind of solve that problem. Or if you really do cover every rooftop in New York City, for example, with solar panels, right? That might get you a certain part of the way. Um, but if it's all upstate, you have to expand transmission. And expanding transmission has proven nationwide to be a difficult thing to do. Just there's been repeated political pressure not to do it, even though that actually is probably the biggest barrier to getting to somewhere close to 100% renewables. In New York State, we're actually relatively lucky because we have the Great Lakes. And there's a fair amount of reliable hydropower that we can draw upon. But again, that's upstate, and you still have to get that power downstate, and that's proving to be a fairly sticky problem. Again, I don't think that there's any area that's managed to solve that.
I'd like to stay with you on this and maybe tease out a little bit for those who aren't as familiar with the behaviors of different energy sources. Can you talk a little bit about the differences in capacity factor among different energy sources
Mhm.
and then within that I think once you explain that it will help to iterate what some of the challenges or reveal what some of the challenges are with relying on wind and solar alone, but then perhaps you can talk about some of the challenges in adding additional other types of clean baseload power that are being discussed in other places, like, say, hydro or geothermal.
Yeah. So by capacity factor, I think what Alexander means is it's how much of the generation that you've nominally built is available at a given time. So if you built a gigawatt solar array, for example, you don't actually have access to that gigawatt in any given hour of the day, right? That's kind of the maximum that you might be able to generate in a given time. And so for solar, there's a pretty strong diurnal pattern, by which I mean it follows the day. So if you had a totally clear day, you get much less generation near sunset and sunrise, but then, in the early to mid afternoon, you get peak, maximum amount of generation that you could. Um, there's some complications there to, depending on how the solar array is built exactly and the angle of the sun, but those are not super critical. The main point is that like that's a relatively predictable thing. What's not predictable for solar are clouds, right? And the impact of clouds, and particularly convective clouds, so the cumulus clouds that kind of pop up in the middle of the day and move over, these are highly unpredictable. They're not the result of usually of large scale fronts the way that, other cloud types are. And they can suddenly just block the angle or the path of the solar radiation to a particular array. So that can play a big role in attenuating the amount that you get in a given day or a given hour from solar. And then on top of that, because of the Sun-Earth geometry, so the way in which the Earth orbits as it and rotates as it moves around the sun, and the fact that the Earth is angled, you get different amounts of solar energy potential in the summer versus in the winter. So that also there's a seasonal effect there as well that plays out. For wind is just it's a lot less predictable. It tends to be much more stochastic. So you tend to see more wind in the winter and you tend to see more wind at night. So generally colder temperatures are when you see more wind. Not always the case, right? You certainly can get high wind events in the summer, but it's just less on average likely. But again, it's just much more random. And so the predictability of wind is just a lot lower. Hence why there's a benefit to pairing renewables with batteries because the batteries can then absorb excess power during times when you need it and shift that to times when you don't, right? So one of the big ideas also is if we have enough electric vehicles, they can also serve as kind of batteries at large, right? Because they can kind of be plugged into the grid and can kind of charge or discharge as is helpful. That's sort of one of the demand response options that people have talked about quite extensively. So those are kind of the issues with renewables, right? And why they're not necessarily when people talk about variable renewable generation, that's what they're talking about. Again, these are not problems that can't be solved. You can actually get a pretty high penetration of a grid with renewables if you assume you have enough transmission. Um, Much more and like much more than people estimated. People have been putting artificial caps on what that level looks like in the literature, and like China or California keep exceeding them. Um, but they're not 100%, right? And a large part of that is because you do have these periods where you haven't been able to bank enough, or you have these really extended, what the Germans call Dunkelflaute, which are these weather-induced joint changes to where there's not a lot of wind and there's not a lot of solar, and you've depleted your batteries. And then what do you do? And so that's the and then you need transmission on top of that, right? Everything I've said assumes you have perfect transmission, and then you still need transmission. Hydropower tends to be pretty stable. So there's a difference between run-of-river hydro power, which is more dependent on precipitation, just like wind, highly stochastic, right? Really, really depends on what's going on. And we have a little bit of that scattered throughout New York State. The big player for hydropower for us are the um, Saunders and Niagara plants that really generate massive amounts of electricity. I mean, in a lot of ways, they are the backbone of any envisioned New York net zero grid. Um, the trick with them is that we share the Great Lakes with Canada. And we have a treaty with Canada that restricts how much water we can withdraw from the Great Lakes at those sites. And it's actually a fairly complex institutional arrangement. The other complexity there is the Great Lakes, the volume varies on a decadal scale. So there's a hydroclimatic cycle of about every 10, 20-ish years over which the Great Lakes volume ebbs and flows. And that means that in these certain of these periods, that volume is going to be lower and we can withdraw even less hydropower from the lake. So there's a little bit of complexity to how the Great Lakes give us power, even though we can generally treat those as really large, firm, low carbon, dispatchable generation at the moment. Nuclear power is pretty much always available. It's a baseload technology. You don't want to really cycle nuclear plants. At least, people are talking about this with some of the newer technologies that you may be able to cycle them a little bit more. But traditionally, nuclear plants, you basically wanted to keep them at a very stable level of generation, not turn them on or off if you didn't have to, move them up or up down a little bit. And so, that has certain advantages. One is that they're low marginal cost of generation. So there's every unit of electricity generated by a nuclear plant generally does not cost a lot of money compared to, for example, fossil fuels. Um, Actually, the cost of electricity from nuclear plants is almost always a function of the capital expenditure of building the plant in the first place. It's not the fuel cost or the labor cost of generating that electricity. Um, and so generally the capacity factor is very high, right? And it's a good base load. And one of the opportunities that that allows is that you can take some of that excess solar and wind that you would normally use to satisfy a load on a given hour, and you can bank even more of it in batteries, which then helps you address some of those peak load concerns, right? That Richard Paris and I have talked about even more. And so I think there's a potential for a multiplicative effect on the ability to leverage zero carbon electricity that could be provided by a something like a nuclear plant.
Thank you so much. And correct me if I'm wrong, just to kind of simplify it for some of the audience. The my understanding of the general average capacity factors for each of these, so the amount of time that they are actually generating power for you throughout their lives, solar might tap out around 25%, you know, wind around maybe 30, 35. Gas plant, I think, is around like 60%. Coal plant is around like 70, 75%. Hydro, I would assume, is somewhere between like 75 and
Depending on the
85-ish,
type of hydro.
depending on the type of hydro. But then nuclear in the United States is like 95 to 97% with that, single digit amount of downtime being unplanned outages or refueling. And I think those numbers kind of help to illustrate,
Mhm.
the role the unique role that nuclear, is seen as playing in some of these reliability issues. Richard, I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of color about what some of the challenges have been around transmission, given that transmission is this big bottleneck problem that we have and is, certainly this massive bottleneck that we would have if we were to go a route toward decarbonization in New York State without nuclear in our most densely populated area. What has that been like, and what have those I- you know how have those issues sort of made that more difficult?
Thank you for the question. I just want to just recap on some of the things that were just talked about by Vivek, and I thanks for all the knowledge. That's really helpful for everybody on the webinar as well. I believe there has to be a responsible blend. I think people take too much polar ends of nuclear's bad and it should only be solar and wind, or that there needs to be a responsible blend to keep up with the demands of the upcoming loads and electrification, right? But in our industry, when we talk and live the grid, we don't like to, hang our hats on maybes. If maybe the sun might shine right, or maybe the wind's blowing, or we're talking about serving the public with electricity that runs their lives and heat and, life-saving equipment. We really, it's important to have nuclear, one, because it's carbon free and it's on demand. We know it's going to be there, right? Like we said, it runs straight, it runs true. You only adjust it a little bit. You really don't take it out unless you're refueling it. You have some outage due to equipment or a trip offline. But I think the temperature on the conversation needs to be even and blended, right? But it is very important to have on demand, and I want people to know that the importance of that. I mean, we talk about hydro and other areas that haven't quite come along yet, but when you look at nuclear, it's the fleet is responsible for more than 700 million metric tons of carbon being off the system, which amounts to like 100 million cars. We talk about the fuel, and like it was stated, the fuel's really not the expense of it, but the waste of it too. If you talk about the amount of fuel that has been or spent fuel across the nation has been like 90 metric tons that might fill up a football field since the 50s. That's less than 10 yards deep. You look at a thimble of uranium is equal to 1 ton of coal, or 120 gallons of oil, or 70,000 cubic feet of natural gas. So there are upsides to this. Uh, so what the grid is seeing with the loss of, just say, Indian Point, right, is we're turning to fossil fuels. Whether we like it or not, we need those megawatts on the grid, and gigawatts. And what it's doing is it's straining the grid, which is already aged and stressed. And for the utility companies across the United States to keep up with just keeping it modernized and up to date and working properly is a challenge in itself. Transformers, reactors, these things take a long time to build. And the challenges that people don't see behind that is we're really keeping up with the curve to keep the grid healthy and up to date. This is just an added stress to it. And down the road, if we can't keep up with the curve with on-demand power, the public is then going to start to see the stress like they do in California with rolling brownouts and load shedding and whatnot. So these are the stresses that we do see. They're real. The maybes are, what are we going to do in the future if we can't catch up to this curve? And that's what we think in our industry. When is the conversation going to come to the middle where we could all agree that there could be a blend, and it doesn't have to be nuclear is bad and only wind and solar, or vice versa. There has to be an area where we all agree on a blend, and on-demand power has to be a part of the picture.
Great. So I want to start getting to some of the questions that are in the chat. There's some really good ones. Paris, I think you might be good to answer this one. We have a question here about why don't we just replace the infrastructure at Indian Point with brand new AP1000s? That may make the public more comfortable knowing that it's
Mm.
brand new technology with passive safety features, and that it would ostensibly then last even longer because it was brand new.
Mm. So I love the AP1000. And so we learned a very hard lesson at Vogel, right? Like it was over budget, it went way past its time, and it's now going to be deployed hopefully at VC Summer. So with Indian Point, I think that's going to be up to the state and local community and the folks that get behind it if we do choose to rebuild. And just currently with the information that we have, Holtec at the moment, if we look at Michigan, restarting Palisades, it was only shut down for a little bit. They don't have to do the extensive work that Indian Point would require. And they're going to build some SMRs on site, is what they propose. So with Indian Point, what we find, or what I'm seeing, at least from external, is that it is an existing site that we can rebuild, or if you do want to do AP1000, but I do think regardless of the reactor design, because Indian Point already has so much history and the name already itself can be triggering for folks, or can bring up certain memories. I think the work is not going to be around what reactor design or how the rebuild. I think there's going to be a great need for effective communication and buy-in from members. And we have an open letter that I'll share. We'll send a link to folks that attended, kind of detailing our argument to explore this option, and shows the local members that have signed on. And so we can see what they would like to see. So I'm not opposed for AP1000s. Holtec, I don't know if would be opposed or not, but I don't think we should focus on the specific reactor. I think there's a lot of other components that we'd have to focus on first.
So here's another one, and I'd like to invite you to answer this first, Richard, and then Paris. I think you could weigh in on this as well. But one of the biggest concerns that this questioner is raising is that while they would really support Indian Point and support nuclear generally, that the local government passed a resolution unanimously against the reopening, and if it were to reopening, it would require unanimous support to pass it. Locally, there seems to be a lot of opposition. Is there a risk of pursuing a campaign to restart Indian Point, and then perhaps jeopardizing some of the support for building new reactors further upstate, which is under discussion and being backed by the New York Power Authority and Governor Hochul. So I'll pose that to you first, Richard, and then Paris, if you can weigh in.
I mean, I don't think there's a risk to it. I think the only thing is some of these projects take a little time, but at the end, the reward is there, which is on-demand clean power. I mean, what it does politically, I've seen that political conversation swing from one side to another, and people flip-flop on their beliefs and ideas behind it. So it's hard for me to say that. I do have a chance to chat with assembly people and whatnot, and they're and local folks, and their conversations change within the matter here and there over the years, especially since the closure of Indian Point. So that question probably not for me as much, but no, I only see reward out of building nuclear plants. I really don't see anything down the line that would be negative.
Paris?
Yeah, I think circumstances like what we've seen, I'll hone in on just California as just the example, my lived experience, the example that we have is that circumstances can change political appetite, and as I mentioned in the introduction, we are in a completely different time than we were back with Indian Point. Natural gas was cheap. There was a governor who did not want nuclear. There was incessant lawsuits from a group, and the owner itself did not want to deal with it and be in a merchant market. So what I can say is that sometimes uh, from our experience in California, everybody said don't touch it. And what we saw in the media, it was anti after anti after anti. But if we do some polling, we find that sometimes just the loudest voices don't mean they are representative of the local community. When I was watching, a Westchester executive talk about that Indian Point will not be restarted, they do not want to pursue it. So on Facebook, look through the comments, 90% were in favor of it. So I don't think that we fully have opened up the discussion to fully say that it wouldn't be possible and that the locals wouldn't support it. Because with our conversations with certain locals, some are in attendance today, they are interested in kind of see what that new opportunity would look like. And as far as upper state, guys, big energy infrastructure projects takes time. Transmission takes time. There's going to be obstacles. And so I don't believe that that is an argument to not talk about Indian Point for if Indian Point at the moment initial estimates say 4 years, $8 to $10 billion LPO incentives. It'd be the fastest and largest return of clean energy to the grid. So why wouldn't we want more? In upper state, new nuclear is going to take time, baby, and that's good because good projects that last a long time will take time. So I think we can do both. I don't think we need to get stuck in this black or white, this polarization where if you have one, you can't have the other.
Yeah, Richard, please.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so the importance is, in the utility industry, when these plants were even the conversation came up to close them down, no one looked at it favorably. We all knew what was at stake. But when plants like Indian Point and other plants finally get closed down, I think it's very important politically that the conversations are put around them in a sensible manner because you have the infrastructures there to either replace the nuclear reactors, depending upon age, and use the infrastructures around it. Where now, because of fear and the political volume that was spread for Indian Point, now, sites like this are further into decommissioning, which makes it a little bit harder to get back. So, and this is what happens when too many opinions are thrown into the pot, and then one opinion sort of takes off. So, I mean, the people in the utility business, I mean, we knew as soon as it was being talked about for the closure of Indian Point, we knew it was at stake. We knew it was safe. The stories that we were reading in the paper, we knew were false. I mean, we ran that plant very safely for decades.
So, Vivek, I was wondering if you could answer two kind of technical questions that we have here in the chat. One of them is asking if you can illustrate for us the difference in land area required for a gigawatt of nuclear versus a gigawatt of solar panels. And then secondly, if you could tell us a little bit about the volumes of radioactive waste and how that is dealt with at the site currently.
So just to head off, I definitely cannot speak to nuclear waste in any meaningful capacity. I will not pretend to be a nuclear engineer. But um, the the question about land use is an important one. I used to have the rule of thumb in my head of the conversion between megawatts and the acreage, and I do not have that at the moment. But it's a lot, right? You know, a gigawatt of that's the downside to the major downside to renewables, right? It's not necessarily variability; it's the amount of land that's needed is can be constraining, and especially when you run into areas where there are political headwinds into building solar or wind or transmission or batteries, for that matter, that can pose a major problem. So. Um, the other side of it is there are siting restrictions as well, right? So there are conditions that are not very suitable to put solar arrays. And in general, you tend to see these sites being put along roads and along near existing transmission infrastructure because it reduces the cost of installation and servicing for the solar plants. So there's actually less. It's not to say that there isn't land available, but there's less available than one might think, and it is a pretty hefty footprint, So, comparing something like nuclear or Indian Point to how much land you would need for an equivalent wind or solar site it's not even. I mean, it's not close, right? And I don't want to hazard a number because I don't have it off my head, but yeah, it's large.
Yeah, in orders of magnitude difference.
Yeah.
Paris, perhaps you can help answer the waste question. I mean, I'll note, that during my time at the, well, I'll first just note for the audience the kind of statistic everybody likes to cite from the Department of Energy, which is that you could take all of the radioactive spent fuel, from the last, 6.5 decades of commercial nuclear operation in the United States, and it would fit in, I believe that, on a football field or, in a Walmart supercenter. It is on the whole, relatively small in terms of the physical volumes compared to the volumes of electricity that was generated from it. I will note that at the actual Indian Point site, that they are stored in a big gated area in these dry concrete casks, where they can safely sit for years and years while we await the federal government to make a final decision about what waste storage is meant to look like. And I'll note that one interesting detail I didn't know until visiting the plant a few weeks ago is that Indian Point is actually very conveniently located close to a rail line in Connecticut that connects to another rail line that goes to one of these intermediate storage sites where nuclear waste goes as we await some kind of a final solution, whether that's reprocessing or burying it at a site like Yucca Mountain. But am I missing anything in that explanation, Paris? And I guess generally, how have you seen this question that I think comes up a lot all over the world about nuclear, this question of waste? How have you seen attitudes about that shifting in some of the other places where you've seen a reversal of a phase out?
Yeah, so I would say waste was my biggest concern when I started learning about nuclear. And it is a major concern for folks. And I think similar to the treated water, you hear radiation, you hear radioactive, and it's going to be radioactive for how many years? It's all about context. And I've been very fortunate enough to go see so at Indian Point, the spent fuel rods or used fuel rods are in the canisters, as Alec mentioned, bolted to the ground, monitored, and checked to make sure that the integrity of the cask is maintained. They're licensed up to, I think it's 20 to 40 years, and then they do a check and resubmit and see how they're doing. So I visited Diablo Canyon, San Onofre, been to the Netherlands, and I think the biggest lesson I can share with folks from, international work that I've done is that you need to talk about it. And I think it's in general around nuclear industry is very quiet, closed doors. It seems very technical. There's no bridge to what it actually means, what it actually means for you, safety, the context. So in Cobra, they have low, intermediate, and high level waste. So for folks, there's radioactive waste that's low and intermediate that you see that can be throughout our lives in other industries. And at Cobra, they display beautiful pieces of art from the Zealand Museum there because it has same temperature that is needed to maintain them. And they do tours. So all I can say is I got a tour at Indian Point, so did Alex. And for some folks, I bet a tour could be something if you're really interested in it. But what we see is with knowledge, it reduces the fear and adds an example and context for folks. And everything produces waste, right? And it's the pros and cons and it's the trade-offs. And because of the energy density, it's a very small amount. But for Indian Point, it is kept on site. They're in the cans, they're monitored. And I do believe you could possibly ask some further questions if you'd like at the decommissioning hearing that's next week on the 11th. And all the assemblies have been moved from the pool. I just received confirmation. So they're all in the cans at Indian Point.
Great. There's I know we've discussed throughout this, what some of the risks are from other energy sources that have replaced nuclear since the closure of Indian Point, to the people who live nearby them. For example, Vivek was talking about these peaker plants around New York City, and you have areas of the Bronx and of Queens that are described as asthma alley because of how they're burning oil at times and producing a lot of local emissions, and that has been really inflammatory to different illnesses in those areas, and they tend to be working class and tend to be non-white. Um, but we do have a question here from someone who feels a little ad hominem. It's asking, who of the panelists lives close to the Indian Point site. I don't think that that's a valid point necessarily, but I do think it is a valid point to raise, what the actual effects are that we know to people who live near a nuclear power plant and live near Indian Point. And I'll leave it to any of the three of you to answer from what we know on average around the country, around the world, or specific to Indian Point, what the effects are of people who are living in that very close area.
But at least to the first part. So actually, I grew up in Southern Dutchess County. My parents have, lived there my entire life. And my next door neighbor growing up worked at Indian Point. And so, like it's not it's upriver, right, from where Indian Point is, but like I do have a long-standing connection to the Hudson Valley, and my parents are still there. So, this is not something that's totally foreign, right, in terms of the discourse around it and the specifics there.
Great. Paris or Richard, would you be able to speak a little bit to, what we know about living next to a nuclear plant?
Yeah, I'll just say, and I think Richard, you had some really good points on, and when we were debriefing before to get in preparation for this panel. But on average, maybe to tee it up, is on average, communities near nuclear plants have a higher favorability towards it. I'll just keep it to real life examples in San Luis Obispo, where Diablo Canyon is. There is high support, and many folks do work there, and it is one of the not highest, one of the biggest industries and employers of that area. And our friend Heather Hoff, that is a co-founder of Mothers for Nuclear, gets to be a single mother, buy a house in California, and live in a beautiful town on the California coast because she works at that nuclear plant. So these are high-paying jobs, and it's not just engineering jobs. And as Richard can probably attest to, like the local benefits, the jobs, economics around it. Um, there's trade jobs. There's other folks that get to go in and help with like outages and certain things like that. So what we've seen on average, local community they get the most benefits and they have higher favorability on average towards the facility because they're there, they can see it, they know a person who works there. And I think having that connection can really be valid. You can answer your question, or you could ask your questions to those folks.
Great. We
Thanks,
are coming
Michael.
up on time. I'll invite each of the panelists if you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share before we let the audience go. But I will, I thank you all for your questions and encourage you to get in touch if we didn't get to them.
I guess I could started up. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to listen to our experiences and our knowledge here. As far as the talk around nuclear, I'm excited as a utility local here and someone who has represented the men and women who worked in Indian Point. We're excited about the conversation at least coming to life again. Um, I think it's very important that everybody that was on this webinar or anybody that you have that's a friend or family that's interested to take a deep dive into nuclear and where it started and where it is now, because the safety behind it is light years ahead of where it was back with Gen 1 nuclear reactors. So I think a lot of the hesitation behind nuclear is behind fear of old technologies, and I believe that everybody should take a deep dive in and really know where the safety has come with nuclear and how far we've come. Because it's carbon free, it's on demand, and it's something that we should all be looking forward to. Thank you.
Go, Vivek.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I think that the grid is facing a lot of challenges, right? And these challenges are only going to get more acute. And, energy is so fundamental to every part of our society that this is really something we need to start taking extremely seriously. At the same time, right? Climate change is also a really significant factor and a strong concern that we need to address. And so if we think about how do we balance these two things, there are a number of different options. And I'm not, one of the reasons I said at the beginning that I don't necessarily have a vested interest in what the outcome of that debate is that not each of these solutions is going to look right for every different region of the country, right, or any given state or any given locality. But I think it's important to have these kinds of conversations about what the trade-offs look like, what the pros, and when there are cons, what those cons look like of the different options. I think it's a mistake to evaluate one technology such as nuclear in total isolation because that lets you kind of say, well, okay, there are downsides, so let's not do that, when the downsides might be greater of any of these other options. And so I think having that holistic view and having these sorts of conversations is a really valuable part of figuring out which of these solutions. And I think Richard is right that like you need a portfolio, right? So there's no silver bullet here. There's no one magic trick that is going to get you to a zero emissions, fully reliable grid. You need a portfolio of options and it's important to navigate what the different trade-offs are and how they blend together in ways that may amplify our chances of success.
Right. And I think I'll just cap off that, as I said in the introduction, we're in a new moment. New York is having has a possible opportunity in front of them, and it's a completely different time than when Indian Point was shut down. And so I think if we care about sustainability, if we care about, moving forward and securing this clean energy future and maintaining affordability and reliability, because that is a bipartisan concern, I think it would be a disservice to not explore this opportunity before us. And this is only the start of the conversation, and many more folks will need to take this on and more local involvement. But we wanted to kickstart this conversation off and see where it goes.
Thank you all so much. I think this has been a really informative conversation, and thank you to the Nuclear New York folks and Stand Up for Nuclear for inviting me to do a little bit of public journalism in my own hometown. So I'm thankful for your attention and for all the very sharp questions. And I encourage you guys. I write on this all the time, and so if you'll allow me to plug myself for sources here. Please feel free to get in touch with me. You can find my work at my last name, kaufman.substack.com. And you can find, if you look up my name, alexanderckaufman.com, you can find a way to contact me. Thank you so much.
Great.